We have a new video from Accursed Farms where he does a Q&A going over all of the questions that some people have. Now, we're actually going to go through this. It's already a long enough video as it is. Relax, sit back. There's going to be a lot here. We'll have some diagrams and stuff like that, and I'll draw some stuff at some point. But I have my own questions and some concerns as well about Stop Killing Games. But I'm going to be editing a lot of this Q&A just because there's some parts that are pretty obvious that I have no concerns with. There are some that I do have concerns with, and the ones I have concerns with are the ones that I'm probably going to edit in. If you want to see the full context of Accursed Farms video, the link is in the description down below, so feel free to check it out if you have questions and everything like that. But with that said, this video is already long enough as it is, let's get to it. Okay, so this is Ross from Accursed Farms. He's the one who is actually heading up the initiative for Stop Killing Games. This will be good. I haven't watched this yet, so we'll see what happens.
Hi, this is a video on the Stop Killing Games campaign I've been doing, specifically the European Citizens Initiative. Now, since that's kicked off, I've seen lots of questions and concerns pop up. That's probably my fault. I don't want anyone to be against this campaign because they feel like they don't have enough information.
Okay.
Now, if you're already on board with this initiative, or if you're completely against it, then you probably don't need to watch this. In fact, I don't recommend it. It's probably going to be long and boring.
Oh, great.
This is
well,
for people
hold on, Ross. I will try not to make this video long and boring, I promise. I'm on the fence about this whole thing. I want games preservation. If you buy a game, you should be able to play it. But I also think that some things are just unrealistic. We'll feel this out.
We'll really want to drill into the details. Now, if you're watching this, I'm assuming you've watched one of these videos already.
Yes.
But if not, super quick recap. We've launched a European Citizens Initiative that, if passed, would allow customers to retain working copies of games they've paid for. Mostly full stop. It's more complicated than that, but that's what this and those videos are for. There's a few core concepts that are going to come up again and again and might help frame all of this.
Okay.
Concept number 1, always ask, what's the alternative?
Okay.
I don't know if I've communicated this well, but I'm actually in favor of any solution that solves the problem of video games being
fantastic
destroyed.
You know, well, I'm glad he says this because hopefully if I disagree with something, I can provide a solution or some kind of explanation to maybe help. We'll see.
So when I hear criticisms of our plan, my first thought is always, what's the alternative solution that saves video games? Concept 2, most of what we're doing is about future games.
Sure.
For existing games, don't worry, we'll get to that. Third concept, almost done. It is impossible to save games without some effort from developers and some disruption to the industry. And the last core concept, the European Citizens Initiative is not final law. Something about it will change. It's inevitable. What we're trying to do is aim the arrow the best we can and hope it hits the mark. Okay, questions. Isn't your initiative too vague?
I had this concern.
There's a few layers to this question. Like, remember concept 4. And it's not actually supposed to be final law. Like,
yeah, after reading up on this, you're supposed to make the initiative vague. Yeah, that's on me. Just being an ignorant American, I don't know European law.
You know there's a word limit to it? It's supposed to be a basic explanation and your reasons for it. In some ways, this slide I posted is more important than the initiative itself.
Okay. Require video games sold to customers to be in a reasonably working state at the time of shutdown / end of support. We'll talk about that. Prohibit any requirements for video games sold to customers to connect to the publisher or affiliated parties after support ends. Okay, that's fair. Yeah. Require the above also apply to video games that sell assets or features, microtransactions to customers. This one I have a concern about because that one's tough to enforce. Each one of these progressively gets more complicated as you go down each one.
Because this roughly reflects the views of the organizers, the people who will be going to Brussels to discuss this with the EU. Like in the initiative, some were asking what is meant by a reasonably functional or playable state. Well, if it's a racing game, I would think that means you race cars in the game world. If it's an arena shooter, I would think that means you enter game maps and shoot at other players.
Well, I would argue that it doesn't have to be other players. Bots would also suffice in that. But you are doing combat against opponents, whether it be computer controlled or players.
If it's an RPG, boy, that could mean fight monsters, talk to NPCs, use items, manage your inventory, lots of stuff.
My thing is, I would expect a game to be playable from start to finish, and at least in one path of progression. That's generally what constitutes an alpha. Let's talk about what an alpha is. Most people nowadays, they see alpha and beta. You'll see like alpha test, beta test, everything like that. Alpha just means playable through one path. Whenever we get to an alpha stage, if there's a warrior class and you can play, like it has all its skills and abilities and you can play the game from start to finish, the intended path of start to finish as the warrior, but you can't as the mage, that's considered an alpha. Alpha is just playable through one path of progression. Beta means that like everything should be in there that's supposed to be in there. We're just trying to make sure that everything else is good, like tidying up and everything like that. For games preservation, I think that a game should be playable in an alpha state, at least. For an RPG, I make a warrior and I can play through the entire game as a warrior, but the mage doesn't work. Well, that's still a functional game, just not in the way that you want, right? So that's a thing that I would distinguish right off the bat.
But what if we try to be specific and make the law race cars in the game world? Well, does that work for the arena shooter?
I do agree that functional in a playable state is vague enough to where it can literally mean anything. There could be some malicious compliance there.
Okay, I am not speaking for the initiative members in this next part. It's not a hive mind. Some agree with me, some are more radical than me. But here are some compromises I personally might agree to. Instead of insisting that the game works on shutdown, have a best effort from the developers so that savvy users could repair the game. This could be server binaries, server source code, though again, this is optional, guys. That would not be the only option. I'm not mandating that. Or if you want to be really generous, repair instructions.
I don't agree with any of these. This isn't an open source initiative. It's a games preservation initiative. And that is a completely different thing. Let's go ahead and keep going through this.
Here, I'll pull up my old slide from a while back.
Okay, absolute minimum effort necessary for games as a service developers to give customers a chance to run games after shutdown. Oh geez, we're gonna have to define games, aren't we? Let's define some games here, right? So we have a single player game, right? Single player. All of these represent games, right? Then we have what? So single player with DRM. Then we have what? Multiplayer games, right? Multiplayer with player servers. Then we have, multiplayer with DRM. So you needed to log into a launcher to then log into the game, even, to play online and stuff like that. So that gives the illusion of it's online only and everything like that. You can't make any servers or anything. All the servers are hosted by the main company. So technically you have no other option but to log in and play those games. So then we have like any game with DRM behind a storefront. Signify like it looks like a washing machine. So you want the game. The game has DRM already on it that requires an online connection. You buy it from the store. That goes to a launcher, which then goes to the DRM and says, hey, you can play it. And then finally you can play your game. You would expect to have, like, say, for example, Steam or Epic. If you buy the game, it launches through those particular systems, but it doesn't, especially for like EA or Ubisoft. And it's just getting worse and worse. You need to have their launchers to then open the game and then play from there. So you have DRM with the store, you have DRM with the launcher, and then you have DRM for the actual game. Back in the day, you had physical game boxes, right? So you had a product on a shelf and you would go to a store and buy it. Over time, illegal copies were starting to be made. You would have the first cases of DRM, which was, hey, you need to have the manual, and it would say something like, hey, on page 13 of the manual, what's the fifth letter on the third column of whatever? And then you would put that into the game, and then you would be able to play. Well, people started making copies of that. So they started including physical objects like a wheel with a wheel and another wheel, and you would have to line up different sections of the wheel together to make a word or a phrase, and then you would put that into the game so that you can actually play it. And what is the whole point of DRM? It's to make sure that you're protecting your game as a developer. After these manual types of DRM, and there were others, you started getting different types of DRM. Secure ROM came on a disk. And what I mean by it came on a disk is it came on the game disk. For Secure ROM, you would need to have the game disk in the computer itself. It would validate on that and then say if you could play it or not. But that's still DRM that you're in control of. As long as your disk worked, then you could continue to play the game. You would just need to physically put it into the system. But then we started getting into online DRM. How does all of these work? What is each one of these? So a game launcher requires an account, right? A lot of these have to do with accounts and stuff like that. And then you log into that game launcher with that account and you launch the game from that launcher. Storefronts. Well, you need an account for the storefront. You buy the license for the game, and that's really kind of the big deal is licenses, right? But you buy the license for the game, and then in some cases, so there's already DRM here with the storefront because you need to be online to verify that your account actually has a license to actually play the game that you're trying to play. Then there's an additional level of DRM when the game, say for example, an Ubisoft game, you buy Assassin's Creed, that then goes to Ubisoft Connect. You log in with another account there, which might be linked to your Steam account, and then it verifies again that you have access to play that game, and then you have to play through the game launcher. Server restricted content is another type of DRM. The developers will purposefully put something behind a connection to a server when it does not need to be. For example, authentication, you needed to connect to a server to prove that you had ownership of the game, but most of the game itself was just offline. There was really no need to connect online. And then Denuvo comes back to the secure ROM style of DRM, except this goes out to a server and it says, hey, this is a valid game, and then you're good, and go ahead and play the game. But sometimes Denuvo can bring down the performance of a game. Sometimes it's not accurate with its server checks. Sometimes you need to reformat your computer because your drivers are bad and now you have to reinstall your game and stuff like that, but you were just playing it 4 hours ago and now it's technically a different computer, and Denuvo will think that your copy is somehow now invalid and you have to wait 24 hours to be able to play your game. So how did we get here? It all goes back to the game and trying to protect the game. People are trying to make copies of this. We don't want them to make copies because it's stealing our game and our product. We need to make sure that that doesn't happen. We'll grade these. So we had like an A here, that was cute, right? We had a B here. You know, if this gets damaged or whatever, there's no way to recover this, right? I'm grading these based on how preservable they were. You could make copies of the manual, but then that gives people who don't own the manual means to actually own the game as well. You had the wheel, but if the wheel broke, you had no real way of recovering this. Secure ROM, I would say, was a C-. As long as you had the game disc, you could play the game for the most part, but if anything happened to that disc, it got scratched or disk rot or some other thing happened, then you could no longer play your game. And that's technically, you could technically argue that, well, that's fine, but you couldn't make backups of it. You couldn't do anything like that to actually, in case of emergencies type situation, of still playing your game. Then we get to online DRM. Get an F-. This is just terrible. I buy a game on a storefront. Well, I buy a license for a game on a storefront, and then it goes to a different launcher instead of launching out of the launcher that I bought it from. Like if I buy a game on Steam, it'll open up in Ubisoft Connect. Why? Denuvo is great, but the worst thing about it is that it requires online. Why do I say Denuvo's great? Denuvo's great just because it works. I mean, for all intents and purposes, that's all you really want is for it to do the thing that it says it's going to do. And it all comes back to preserving the game. If you don't make money, you don't make games. That's really, I'm sorry to tell you, it is a business. That's really what it comes down to. Let's talk about what was supposed to happen. So we start again over here. We have the game. When we started getting into digital games, two things should have happened. One, let's just say it's $60, right? The digital game immediately should have been $30. This should have been a thing. If you want the physical good, you pay more for it. If you want the digital good, you pay less for it because you have less rights with the digital version. Why do I think that this should have happened? This requires manufacturing cost, materials for cases, for printing the discs, for the manuals, everything like that. There is a much larger cost to this, but you are paying a premium to physically own the game. This, not so good, right? If you were selling this for the same price of $60, a digital game is a copy and paste of an executable. You can print up a whole bunch of keys, everything like that, but there's literally nothing that needs to be done to make a new digital version of the game. So why are we charging the same price for the physical game? It should have always been from the beginning when we started getting to digital games, digital only games, that they should be cheaper than the physical games because you don't have manufacturing and printing overhead of the physical game. That didn't happen. Let's say this did end up being the reality, and we had physical games being $60 and digital games being $30. The digital games, we should have figured out a way to be able to trade or sell, right? Like not make copies of them, but have them be contained in a way that you can sell them and trade them or whatever. But because we couldn't figure out how to do that, we made the license, right? You don't own the product, you own the license to access that product. Why did we come up with licenses? It's because we couldn't figure out how to make digital games tradable. But then this license term, this started getting applied to physical games as well. If you buy any game on Steam, anything that has an EULA, end user license agreement, that L there means license. Anything you buy on Steam, it says this is a license for a service. If Steam goes down, so do all of your games. Why didn't we find a way to make digital games tradable? And how could we? Well, really the only way is blockchain technology, I think, right now. If you want to have actual ownership of a digital game, that's a way that you would do it. But don't get into crypto, okay? 99% of the time it's a scam. Don't do it. The blockchain would be the only way that you could actually have a digital good that you could buy and sell and trade. But even then, we all know that's horseshit, right? So as long as games can be copied or protection broken or whatever, what have you, there's going to be piracy and everything like that. And the whole reason we got to where we are today is because of DRM and trying to stop piracy. Okay, well, let's just keep going.
This would kind of be the bare minimum. Okay, back to compromises. Not include subscription service games. I'll get into that one later. And finally, grandfather in existing games. That would be a huge compromise. You're talking mostly about live service games. Isn't it unreasonable to expect to own a service? Oh boy, this is going to be a long answer.
This, I think, is going to be the big crux of this video.
First, let's talk about the legal answer to this. In Europe, the United States, forget it.
Fair.
Subscription-based games, I don't think we have a leg to stand on in regard to commerce law. So that's World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV, and so on.
To that point, and in the comment section of the last video that I did, I discuss preserving MMOs should be a community-driven endeavor and not something that should be held responsible for developers and publishers for MMOs specifically. A lot of these server emulators for private servers and stuff, they give the wrong impression of what the actual infrastructure required for MMOs is. Unfortunately, this is how MMOs are able to actually work. Most MMOs have to be made in proprietary engines with proprietary protocols and services and tools and other things like that. And for MMOs, you have clusters of servers that overlap in different player states, different error handling, several different server types with several different database types that are all interacting and writing constantly and almost in real time, making sure there's no desynchronization, everything like that. And sure, you can make offline versions of it, but keeping a game online, having a developer provide server binaries, that's not something that you actually want because you're going to have to rip out all the garbage that doesn't fit what you're actually trying to accomplish. There's a thing called malicious compliance, and it is following the letter of the law in a way that follows it, but does no one any good. But let's listen to what he has to say.
These games tell you exactly when they end, and that's what normal services do. So yeah, I don't think there's anything in the law that gets us there, and as I mentioned earlier, I also think it's a hard ask. But what about other live service games? Ones that you buy once, then that's it. So games like The Crew, Destiny, Overwatch.
Yeah, those, I mean, they're live service by design, not by actual function. Multiplayer is a big factor of live service games, right? So you have what, MOBAs, you have battle royales, you have online RPGs, some racing games, competitive shooters, looter shooters. Okay, so back in the day, games used to come with dedicated hosting software where players could host their own servers. Things like MOBAs could fit in that no problem. I mean, Dota is what MOBAs were basically born from, and that was in Warcraft 3, where you could play on dedicated servers hosted by players, so that's a given. Battle royales are also easily dedicated serverable. All of that already comes really packaged into the Unreal Engine and other engines, I'm sure, that are being used for these battle royales. And we had 128 player dedicated servers back in the day for Battlefield games and stuff like that. So battle royales definitely could be online RPGs. So what is an online RPG? An online RPG generally is you have a lobby, and then you form up a party here, you make a group, or you go off on your own, and then you get teleported to an instance where you are either playing by yourself or with a group, and only your group. Now, there might be situations where you'll see other people running around in the world and everything like that. That's really just other people who are in your instance. In some of those cases, you'll have like maybe it'll be 20 people tops in that same area as you. Most of these, I call this an online RPG. You have to be online to play. However, there's obviously a single player component here because you can go to the lobby and then play alone in an instance if you would like. A great game of how to do online RPGs the right way is the original Phantasy Star Online. It had an offline mode and it had an online mode. You should have a single player option if you want. If you want to be able to play with friends and stuff like that, you have that option. Racing games, super simple. We've been doing this for years. There used to be dedicated servers and stuff like that for racing games as well. So all that's already covered. Competitive shooters, easy. Counter-Strike, dedicated servers already, that's already a thing. Looter shooters. This one here, they like to market themselves as online RPGs, but really it's no more than just Diablo in a different form. Borderlands is a looter shooter. It has some online multiplayer co-op components, but it's not online only. You can still play it offline. Same thing could be said for Destiny, Destiny 2, The Division 2. These things do not need to be restricted to online to access. But that's what we're stuck with right now. And to preserve those, they should just stop the need to authorize, make a patch, and then just play the game solo. Well, how does this relate to MMOs? Most of the content actually exists in a database, right? So here's a database. So in here, you will have things like an ID, a name of the item, and then like stats, right? And so this gets contained into its own little database, okay? Has IDs, stats, everything like that. Well, you need other databases with other information that contain the rest of the actual game. So why is that? Every single situation that I'm explaining here is going to be different. Not every game works this way. Not every situation works this way. But I'm trying to explain this in a way that you will understand if you're not familiar with how MMOs work, okay? This is a DB, and they could be for anything. And then some of these are coupled to servers. And these servers only function when connected to those databases. Let's say you go to a world server. Well, this world server needs to interact with a whole bunch of other servers as it starts trying to get information that you're requesting of it. Say you open up your inventory. Well, that's a whole different database that it needs to go and actually get information from that might be hosted in another server. Let's say you need to go to the market and that market is in an instance. Well, you end up going to another server that has a different instance, and then you interact with the market that goes to a different database that's hosted by a different server. And all of these things are interconnected for all of it to function, because at any moment, at any time, at all hours of every single day, all of that information could be changing. Your position changes all of the time. It needs to be aware of it all. There is nothing static about an MMO aside from some world assets. Mobs are always moving. Players are always gathering things or killing mobs or going places or doing things like that. You need to be having their player state known as well. There needs to be tons of error correction, and it gets very complicated all the time. How do you make sure that if you buy an item off the market that you don't accidentally duplicate that item? How do you make sure that if you're trading something with a player that you don't accidentally do an infinite money glitch and start duplicating those items without those error corrections and player checks? All of these things are incredibly difficult to actually do correctly. That's why you see all of these exploits and weird things that people are able to get away with in certain MMOs. So why does this matter? You cannot play the game without connecting to the servers because it is a service. It's a digital, I mean, like if you subscribe to Netflix, you don't own all of those movies. You own a subscription to that service. Just like whenever you subscribe to an MMO, you don't own the MMO, you are subscribing to the service. Now, do I want games preservation for MMOs? Absolutely. They should be preserved. But that should be up to the community. Because that server infrastructure, all of this, you don't need half of this stuff. You don't need all of these servers and all of the databases associated with them and some of these regards. Like you think you need player tracking and consensus tracking and everything like that. You think you need APIs that connect to the billing of the main websites and interact with that entire thing? Because not only would you need all of these server binaries, you would need all of the servers that go and connect all of the stuff together. Like you want all of the website servers, you want all of the databases, you want everything that goes associated with it. I disagree with that. You should not be entitled to all of this. The protocols that are used for communicating between these things are proprietary. It has nothing to do with the game data that you purchased, the assets that you have as a client. If the initiative, so I mean, obviously Ross already said that the subscription-based games would not be included. They would be exempt from this particular thing because you have an idea of when you can stop playing it. However, for the sake of preservation, I would just make a offline version. The problem with that is it's technically a different game because it's not the one that you purchased. If I have Dragon Quest IX, there has to be a shutdown strategy for the end of life of the game. Okay. As a publisher, I might think, okay, so we have Dragon Quest IX. The end of life plan is to make Dragon Quest IX offline, but this is a separate fee. Dragon Quest IX is technically a different game. This is technically not preserved. If I make an offline version of Final Fantasy XI, Final Fantasy XI was on the PlayStation 2, Xbox 360, and PC. The PS2 and Xbox 360 versions, you can no longer play them. The PC version is still going. what if you have the PS2 version or the 360 version and you still want to play it? Well, if I come out with a offline version, that's technically a different game. We're starting to get into a weird area of what constitutes as the original game. If you just make this a patch for this one, if someone makes that final patch potentially break any sort of future private server accessibility. Let's go back to what we were talking about before. How did DRM even come about? How did all of this even start? It was to keep piracy from getting out of hand. The whole idea of the preservations or the initiative is that if you've bought the game, you get to play that game in some capacity once the servers close down. Let's think about that for a moment. We're going to talk about Final Fantasy 14. Let's just make this example Final Fantasy 14. Let's say someone bought the base original game of 1.0 and they didn't like it. They didn't like it and they never came back. They didn't buy 2.0 and start playing again or whatever. They just bought the base game and that is what it is. 2.0, right? So player 2 bought 2.0. They also bought 3.0. And then player 3 didn't buy any of those. They just bought the latest one. And in this box is all of the previous ones too, right? So technically they own all of that stuff. Who do you cater to? Who actually gets to play what? Now you could say like, well, you just have the server binaries with all of the content in it, but that's not what they bought. You don't get all of the patches and everything, right? Like these games, like 1.0 doesn't even exist anymore. How do you even preserve that for that player? 2.0, I would argue, also does not exist in the same capacity as it did whenever you bought it. So what experience do they actually get? Do they get the experience that they paid for at the time of sale when they stopped playing? How does this work? If they get the game in 6.0, that's not the same game as it was in 2.0. It's not the same game as it was in 3.0. MMOs evolve and change over time. 1.0 doesn't even exist anymore. An MMO could entirely change, especially in the case of Final Fantasy 14. I think that's enough whiteboard. Ultimately, it comes down to it's incredibly tricky when it comes to MMOs and games preservation. Do I want MMOs to be preserved? Absolutely. But that should be up to the community. I do not think free-to-play games should be required to be preserved because you didn't have to pay for anything to play it. And for those people who say like, well, I bought a digital good in there, I should own that digital good, you have no use for it. It doesn't exist. I don't know how you even enforce that. I read the Australian rules. I don't know why people are considering that. That's supposed to be for a song or a movie or something. It's like something that you buy to actually use, not a service like Netflix or something like that, but you bought an album off of iTunes or whatever, and you have that digital good. Sure, that's your digital good. That's totally fine. These cash shop microtransaction like cosmetics and potions and other things like that, I don't see how you regulate that. I don't see what you're expecting to physically own from that, especially when it's a consumable. How is that enforceable at all? It has no function outside of the application that you have purchased that in. That is an optional addition to the sum total of nothing, right? You decided it would be akin to a donation because you were not required to purchase that with money. If the game itself is free to play and there is content that is locked behind paywalls that you cannot obtain through normal means of play, then that is not a free to play game. And that's a whole different kind of discussion, right? That's a free to start if you go to play the game and a whole bunch of content is locked behind $10 walls and you can only pay money to access that stuff, then yeah, that's not a free to play game. A free to play game is a game that you can play entirely from start to finish, but can pay for additional perks and stuff like that if you so choose to. But I don't see how that would entitle you to any sort of ownership of those items. That's all. let's go back to this video.
It is not clear in multiple countries if those are goods or services. You pay a one-time fee for a product with no stated expiration date. That sounds like a good. But it depends on an external service, except you're not told how long that lasts. So that doesn't really meet the full definition of a service commercially either. The service game, there's stuff I consider a real service and an artificial service. The real services take real people doing something. If they stop, so does the service. Now, the artificial service is being able to run the game. The only reason it's a service is because the code is being withheld. Unlike the other column, no human even needs to be alive for this part to work, because
That's
the
fair.
work was already done. The second the customer has a copy of the server software, it ceases being a service.
I mean, Guild Wars is a great example of that, right? Like Guild Wars, the original Guild Wars. It's an online RPG, but in it, you are required to log in to be able to play it. But for all intents and purposes, you could play that single player if you really wanted to.
We are really stretching definitions to call this part of the game a service. And let me tell you a secret. Any game can be made into a service game. Like, take Super Mario Brothers. You can remove the Goombas and the power block locations, hold that data server side, and then lock you out in the menu until you authenticate. Now, Super Mario Brothers is a live service game.
This is essentially what Destiny does. There's no reason for it to do that, but that's what it does. Just like, basically, I mean, this is essentially what a lot of these quote-unquote live service games do. They don't need to do this, but it's an artificial implementation to fit the definition of a live service to get the license coverage, right? They don't want you to own the game.
That will brick if the company shuts it down. Hooray! All this crap that prevents you from playing the game is artificial. Now, of course, it makes sense to keep running it as a service because you can make a lot of money that way. Plus, all those real service aspects I mentioned improve the quality of the game. And we're not trying to stop any of that. Companies can keep making money as long as they want to. We're specifically talking about cases where all the services have shut down and the company is no longer making money. Now, of course, there can be many legal reasons the company doesn't just release their server software to customers once they're done making money. But guess what? That's why we're trying to get the law changed.
I don't agree with requiring any source code to be released. That is an open source initiative. This is not what this initiative is. This initiative is about preserving the games in some kind of way. That does not mean I have to hand over the entire source code for the project. I shouldn't even have to give server binaries. If I put into work to make the game playable in an offline capacity, that should be good enough. If the community for MMOs want to make private servers, that's on them. That's totally fine. I think we're going to run into a situation where the developers don't want to support servers anymore because it's not making them money, so they shut them down, but they still keep selling the game. All of this is tricky. All of this gets really murky really fast. Okay, I do not agree. I fundamentally do not agree. You are not entitled to the source code. It is not yours. It is proprietary in almost every single way.
Every time MMO emulators get leaked or reverse engineered or released by the devs themselves, it just shows this is all possible.
Server emulation is just emulating what the server actually should do, right? Saga of Rhizome is a very unique situation because that game went through like 3 or 4 different iterations and was just failing left and right. But the developers believed in the game enough to where they put in the work, and that's totally fine. That's on them. But that should not be a requirement for every single person. Server emulation is not the same as hosting an MMO in its normal production capacity. It is all uniquely modified to emulate, just like what console emulators. It is emulating roughly what the console is going to do. And that's totally fine. As long as it's close enough for people to enjoy it, then that's fine. But that should not be on the developers and publishers for MMOs. I just fundamentally disagree.
I would like to see all games people care about saved, even the subscription ones, even though I know I don't have a legal angle on those. Isn't there a chance gaming will get worse because of government involvement? I think there's a bigger chance it gets worse without government involvement. From our perspective, there's nothing worse in gaming than having games you like destroyed.
The biggest thing you have to lose with this entire thing, people just not making games. If there was a requirement to provide the source code for an MMO once it was at the end of life, I wouldn't make one. If there was some law in Australia that said, hey, these digital goods that you're selling people in these free to play online games, they own those and they need to have the rights to those. I wouldn't sell games in Australia. That's all this is really. We need to think about this logically, right? In my opinion, you are not entitled to the source code. Full stop. You did not buy the source code. You did not buy the database. You did not buy the servers. You did not buy any of that. What you bought was a client and all of the assets that are packaged with that client. Technically, if we want malicious compliance here, that is all you were entitled to, is that. I understand and I agree with artificial live service games where parts of the game are on the server for no reason. A battle royale does not need to be a live service game. It can be a dedicated server hosted game. But there has to be a compromise. There has to be a limit because otherwise you will kill that part of the industry. No one will make MMOs anymore. If I were faced with this as a developer, as much as I want my game to flourish and be preserved and everything like that, it is not realistic to require the preservation. Because again, where do you draw the line? For a game like EverQuest 2, it has 20 expansions. Which ones are we saving? The game mechanics actually change between each expansion. Classes get different, skills are different. Sometimes the run speed's different in the world. Sometimes the world itself is different. Where are we drawing the line? Oh, in the future, well, you'll be aware of it, so now you can. You're telling me that every single week I need to take a snapshot so that you can have the exact version and time that you want preserved? I disagree. That entitlement, I think, goes beyond where if you say, hey, I bought this game, I own this game now. No, you own that copy of the game, right? The intellectual property, the actual development that went into it, the source code, everything like that, you do not own any of that. That source code was used to create the executable binary that you were playing on that you bought. That is what you purchased. You purchased that packaged game and nothing else. You would have to make a brand new product that is an offline version of the game. You are not entitled to the source code. You are not entitled to the server binaries. You are not entitled to any of that because you purchased none of that. That was not what you had purchased.
What if in the future 90% of games are online only and they just keep killing them? They're coming for all your crap. The industry refuses to solve.
I think online games you can decouple those a lot easier than for MMOs. A game requiring online does not inherently make it an online game, because that authentication that is required to connect to a server, that requires online. Online is required for that. But is it required for you to play the game? It shouldn't be. In the cruise case, no, it's not. There's plenty of valid things here that I would agree with, but there's also some things that I completely do not agree with.
This problem. It wants more of it. Government's the only option left. Won't this go nowhere because customers signed a EULA that says companies can do this?
Yeah, end user license agreements, I think, are just, they should only be applied to digital goods and not physical goods. The problem is that we never figured out a way to make digital goods isolated in a way to where you can actually own them. So it has to be a license.
What about console games? Are they covered? This one gets tricky. The answer is yes, but it's another one that depends on what the EU says. It might not be possible to release the server on the console also. So what they would have to do is release the server software for another platform that you could host elsewhere. and then be able to point the console towards that separate server.
Or they just make a final patch which essentially kills all external connections, and maybe it makes it playable in some kind of offline state instead. That is way easier from the perspective of a developer. I'm just going to say this now. Making it offline, way simpler and easier, so I just never have to deal with it. Providing server binaries and stuff like that is incredibly dangerous from my perspective, just because we reuse a lot of that code. A lot of that code is proprietary in-house stuff, and if those get reverse engineered, then that can open us up to a lot of vulnerabilities potentially. Patching a game is really the way to go. Now, there can be malicious compliance in that final patch might make the game unable to have actual private servers in the future from the community. There's a malicious compliance issue here where it's like, okay, oh, you want to play the game offline? Yeah, sure. Here you go. There you go. Your game functions and stuff like that. But someone in the community later on makes a private server, and you no longer have the client that can actually connect to that server anymore. Because again, if you start distributing binaries and distributing games to be able to play on a private server, that's illegal. You don't own the intellectual property to be able to distribute that software. So that's a problem, right? That you have to take into consideration is how much of this preservation do we want? If you say like, well, if that's the case, then just give the server binaries, you are not entitled to that. That's not what you purchased. A lot of this gets tricky and nuanced. I'm not trying to be the bad guy here. I'm trying to be realistic and give you an honest perspective on how this actually works.
But where it gets muddy is when you need to pay the console maker just to have that internet access in the first place. So there could still be liability, but it would be off the game publisher's shoulders at that point and onto the console makers. What about mobile games? Would they be affected? I don't see why not, though the sheer quantity of them might lend more weight to the grandfathering argument.
The problem with mobile games that you have is that some are only restricted to certain OS versions, right? Let's say we're in the future. You purchase a game on your phone, Apple, Google, whatever. The OS version is now newer, and you can't play the game because that game doesn't support that OS version. Is the onus now on Google and Apple to make that game work for you? Even though they have no way of actually doing that, they would have to actually modify the operating system to make sure that that functions. How far does this go for compatibility's sake and preservation's sake? Like, how broad is this actually supposed to be? Because we're going to run into a lot of freaking issues like this. Some of these situations are just not reasonable to maintain. I understand wanting games preservation, and a lot of the issue lies with live service games that are not live service games, that are just online for the sake of a DRM and authorization and all of that stuff. But some of these situations are legitimately problems when it comes to trying to make them work long term. And how far does it go, right? Where does it stop? Where does it end?
I think it would be a similar situation as consoles. It either gets hosted on the mobile device or it's released for a separate platform that it can connect to. Won't this mean companies stop making MMO or live service games in the EU? I think it's a complete bluff from any major company saying.
No, it's not. There are Japanese only MMOs. There are Korean only MMOs. You don't have to release any sort of MMO in Europe. Yeah, it's a huge player base, but you don't have to. You also don't have to release anything in Australia. So like, yeah, I mean, like I said before, if I was required to give source code and all the server binaries and everything like that, which again, I do not think you are entitled to as a player. You did not, that's not what you purchased. I would just not make MMOs anymore. Or if I did make MMOs, it would not be in the countries that required that. And you can be mad at me and upset with me all you want, but that is a complete overstepping of what you were actually entitled to, in my opinion.
This. The population of the EU is 450 million people. It's a huge market. The industry stands to lose billions by doing something like that. And remember, This doesn't exclude microtransactions, DLC, even loot boxes. So companies could keep the money rolling in. Now compare that loss to the cost of an end-of-life plan from the design phase.
Here's the thing. Why would I want to provide loot boxes and stuff like that for digital goods that I somehow have to give you ownership over that has no functional use outside of the ecosystem of the game? I don't understand how you enforce this. That makes no sense. For microtransactions and stuff like that, if we're talking about a map pack or DLC or, something that adds to the base game, sure. But if that base game is playable offline, absolutely, sure, I get it. But if we're just talking about like a potion or a consumable of some kind, how do I even how does that work? I'm so confused. I don't think you can include microtransactions in this. Just personally, that just seems weird.
Onward. I still think it could be less than 1%. Companies tend to do what makes the most money. But fine, let's say they pulled out. You think other companies wouldn't rush in to take their market share? The rules would have changed a little bit, but the demand wouldn't have left.
But the rules are prohibitive. The rules are prohibitive, so I don't see how anybody would want to get into that market. It would just be blacklisted. Like realistically, I don't mean to be that guy, but it would just be blacklisted, to be quite honest with you.
Even smaller companies, I think, is also unlikely, especially as middleware solutions for this would emerge.
Like getting into China is incredibly difficult. They have to have their own separate servers. They have to have their own different designs and stuff like that made. Like you can't show bones and stuff like that. Like there's considerations for China and certain rules and stuff like that that need to be put in place. You can't do subscription prices there. You need to do like pay as you go. The problem is their market is incredibly large. So the incentive is there, but they don't require us to give source code after it's done. If they did, I wouldn't sell it there. I don't care how many people they have. Like again, we're talking about there's fundamentals here that there are limits to what I think is acceptable. I want games preservation, but there's limits.
However, point three, the in between phase could be rocky. But to think that they're going to go away, yeah, I guess if companies suddenly stop liking money.
But it wouldn't be money at that point. It'd be liability. That's the truth. It would the liability is not worth the cost. It's not worth the risk.
Wouldn't it be a security risk for companies to release their server
Yes.
software? Mostly no, but
No, it is. It is absolutely a security risk.
there are some cases, yes, this is a valid argument. Particularly when a company shuts down a game, but they have a new game that runs on the same engine. So if users find exploits on the old engine, they have them for the new one potentially.
It's not even engine related. It's just network protocols and other things like that. Network infrastructure, especially for MMOs. The engine itself is irrelevant, right? It's the networking that you use to run the game. And for almost every single MMO has a different, unique, proprietary engine for the most part. A lot of the networking that a company uses is all custom, proprietary, different protocols, different server infrastructures, different databases, everything like that. So it's all very different. And if I just took those and released them to you, the amount of information that's there, like all of the databases have player information. I would have to go and scrub all of those. You're not entitled to the databases anyway. That's not what you purchased. So if without those, you're back to server emulators having to guesstimate a bunch of stuff. And that doesn't make it any easier. It's all very tricky.
I swear I'm not trying to be dismissive, but I have to call on points 1 and 3 again. So the question is, are these outlier cases where this is a problem a good enough excuse to destroy all online-only games?
No, the alternative is just make it offline, right? Like it's you just make the experience offline so that people can still play what they purchased. That's it. But giving you server binaries and all of that stuff like that should not be a requirement.
Of course, I'm going to land on no. The cost is too high for everyone else. Is this only about single player games or multiplayer too? I'll answer that question with a question. What does Destiny 2, The Crew, Need for Speed 2015, and The Division all have in common? Are they single player or multiplayer games? Yes. So even if we didn't care about multiplayer at all, which isn't the case, the industry has forced our hand. So in order to save single player in games like these, we have to save the multiplayer also because they've merged it all together.
Nah, that's not necessarily true. They could just rip out the multiplayer and still keep the server player intact. You just patch out the authorization stuff for that. That's how I see it anyway. So, Destiny 2 would become a single player game. Saving the multiplayer components of a game should not be a requirement. That's just my opinion.
Otherwise, they would just get exempt on almost every game. Plus, an arena shooter with 8 players or 12, you can't have an end of life plan for that?
No, I agree that if this were basically we're trying to get back to how games used to be. They used to be like multiplayer games used to come with dedicated server technology that you could just host your own servers and play them. And I agree with that sentiment. But MMOs have never been like that. That's never been a thing. But for like an 8-player arena shooter, yeah, sure, dedicated servers in the future, if you know that that's a requirement, just plan for that. That's not a problem. That is super easy to do. So I agree with that. But MMOs, no. It has never been a thing, and I don't believe it should be a thing. And server emulators are not what the hardware actually did for actual MMOs. It is emulating. It is pretending to do the job of all of those servers, and that's great for the communities that put those together. But that should not be on the onus and requirement for the developers and publishers. Because how robust do you make it? How many players are going to be playing on this thing? Is it 5? Is it 5,000? Is it 50,000? How am I supposed to know? So if I give you, bunk binaries that only have a pipeline of only 10 players, but you want to host 100 players because it's an MMO, is that my fault? I don't know. So it's like I could seriously restrict your ability if it were up to me. Malicious compliance, right? So what you do is you let the communities handle those projects. It's complex, but the easy answer is just make it offline.
Now, MMOs can be a tall order, but we've seen both legitimate and illegitimate emulators emerge to know this is possible. So it's both. The industry's given us no choice.
I disagree with this point. To that point, obviously, yes, we've seen server emulators, but they're emulating servers, and those are made by community groups that are trying to keep a game alive, right? And they make them in for their use case.
Would developers be required to convert multiplayer games into single-player games? Yeah, this one kind of confused me. I mean, nothing about the gameplay would have to change. It's all about running the game, period. All right, that's it. See ya.
All right. See ya. Thank you for the video, Ross, and thank you for answering all those questions. Yeah, so hopefully I've explained my position anyway, and I don't want to speak for all game developers or anything like that, but there are legitimate concerns here. And as much hate as Pirate Software is getting on this Thor and everything like that, I think he was trying to come at this from a good place. I don't think he was trying to be malicious. I just think that maybe he didn't have as much context to be able to make the arguments that he was wanting to. But I do think there are legitimate concerns. And hopefully I have shared my concerns in a way that makes sense. That's ultimately my thoughts. Whatever happens is going to happen, but I do think that there are legitimate concerns with a type of initiative like this. Hopefully I have explained my points on those clearly. So thank you for watching. I'm sure some people are not going to be happy about this, of course, but feel free to leave a comment if you want to keep discussing this. We had some really good discussion in the comment section of my last video, so that was really nice, and y'all have a good one.